Hello and welcome to today's Fat Tell Daily. Most of Victoria is off today, but the rest of the country keeps on going, and as do we. I'm joined today by Brian Chu. Welcome, buddy. How you doing?
Hey Woody, how's everything going on your end?
I'm very well, thank you, mate. I'm very well, thank you. Your Fat Tell Daily today is quite extensive. Do you want to give everyone a brief introduction, and then we can jump into some questions about it?
Yeah, sure. For the last 3.5 years, I've been writing about some of the I am less well hot topics, but not necessarily the viewpoints that your mainstream media and your officials would talk about. So this included the pandemic, the global virus outbreak, the investigations about the health mandates and the validity and the legality of that. We also talked a bit about the developments in society with regards to ideology, woke politics, and also about developments in geopolitics with the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and also last year's Israel and Gaza, Israel and Palestine conflict. So all this leads up to I would call it a culmination of everything comes to a head with the 2024 US election. The reason is, I believe, while we have President Trump versus what I now believe is Kamala Harris will be running in the Democrat ticket, um, they're, the polar opposites of their policies are significant, and it threatens to divide America even further and possibly the world. But behind that, there are certain things that people probably don't haven't noticed, and I want to bring those issues to light. And more importantly, in terms of what we can do for ourselves, because on one hand, there's not much we can do in Australia in influencing the outcome of the election, and the implications and the fallout of whoever wins is something that again we just have to kind of grin and bear it or bite our lip and bear it. But there is one aspect where I believe we can actually do something about it, and it's about preparing for ourselves from a financial perspective. So that's actually what I covered in what I would call a special pre-election coverage.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one thing you suggest that beyond the obvious political divisions, there's a more fundamental divide between liberty and personal autonomy on one hand versus a kind of a parasitic class, as you describe it. How do you, well, explain those as first, but then how do you see that this dynamic playing out in the financial markets and investors' decisions about what they do with their money?
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about personal liberty, autonomy, and what I would call a parasitic class of unelected bureaucrats. So, in terms of liberty and autonomy, I'm not talking about how we can do whatever we want, but it still comes down to what our action, whether we can make certain decisions without having to. Um, have someone tell us that we've got to do it against our freedoms. Now, we have seen from the pandemic that there were people who were unelected who overruled governments or at least drove governments, corporations, and the media to make certain decisions, and they infringed on our freedoms and our liberties. We have seen also that in the aftermath of it, we're now finding out that these people were clearly overextending their authority. They also had hijacked the research community, academia, and media in order to suppress a dissenting opinion. um, in many ways, they actually manipulated the publications and research industry because of what I would call circular citation. So they cite each other's work, and then create a false consensus, which many people still believe is a um, that's a fact. But if you understand that area of research on that area, that discipline, you will realize that there are erroneous methodologies. There is suppression of valid dissenting opinion. And it's not just with the pandemic, it also applies to climate change, it applies to our societal, um, a lot of societal woes. And all this works together to control the public sphere of opinion. And because in a democratic society where people get to vote, many are swayed to side with a prevailing opinion and then vote according to it. And this is how society actually will function as a result. Because when you think about it, a lot of people believe are made to believe certain things, and then vote accordingly. And when we go down a couple of years, and then you realize that these people have actually lied to you. Um, they will say that they'll have plenty of reasons to say why they have done it. It's for your good. We were uninformed at that time. But when we uncovered the information, the secret email trails or the communication trails, you realize that this was their strategy. They had planned this already, and this was how they're going to do it. Um, have, create what I call create a narrative, propagate that through the media, amplify it by cited by citing themselves. Then they influence the population to behave a particular way. They benefit from it because these people are now in positions of power, and they also strike business deals among themselves. Then later on, as a scandal breaks out, they will then write about how, oh, we probably made a mistake back then, but most people have moved on. Now, this is how the unelected bureaucrats run our society. And it used to be considered conspiracy theory among many people, but now it's no longer a theory because we're just watching these things unravel as a clear pattern once you see it. And the US election of 2024 hopefully will break this cycle because you have a candidate, President Trump, who, for whatever reason, some people don't like him, and I not understand why. Some people say that he's a scripted character, but either way, he currently represents the dissatisfied portion of the population in America and also outside of America who are saying to the establishment, "We know what you're doing. We're going to stop you." Um, And on the other side, we have Kamala Harris, who is not even elected. She was a running mate of Joe Biden, who they unceremoniously removed from the ballot after his botched debate, and also the fallout after the first attempted assassination of President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, on the 13th of July. So, long story short, we are watching um, how the world could possibly overcome this establishment that have held the world under its thumb. And we're going to see whether we can really break out of it or whether this thing continues and we continue to go down this dystopian world that we've been living in for over a century.
Brian, you draw some pretty interesting connections between various forms of institutional control and the financial markets. How do you see this relationship influencing gold's performance as a safe haven asset? Obviously, that's where your investment focus is.
Yeah.
Could you give us a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we'll probably have to roll back to history, roll back in time to 1913, when the Federal Reserve, when the U.S. Federal Reserve Act was passed. I believe it may have been like just the days before Christmas, when there were few um, people in Congress present to vote. And when you pass the Federal Reserve Act, it actually instituted a private bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve, to become the lender, the key lender to the U.S. Treasury, which is, of course, the government treasury. And from there, America being the most influential and powerful nation on earth, probably at that time it was still England, but the Great Britain, but America was fast emerging to become the most powerful nation, especially after World War One. You then have the bank lending to the most powerful government on earth, and from there, creating endless wars and funding the corporations and the interest groups that will lobby and put in people into government to run their agenda. And how's gold related to this? Well, prior to the Federal Reserve, the world was running on a pretty much a gold standard where current countries countries actually had to have a gold reserve, and that would regulate the exchange rate of their currencies. So gold was the base money and also the adjudicator of the financial system. But you had World War One, World War Two, Bretton Woods in 1944 that changed the gold standard into a US dollar and gold um, de facto system. Then, of course, we had the Korean War, Vietnam War that weakened the U.S. Current, you could say, the balance of trade. And in order to prevent the U.S. from potentially hyperinflating too early, um, there was a there was a strategy to set up the U.S. dollar to be backed not only by gold because the U.S. gold reserves were dwindling, but with petroleum, with oil. And that meant the US had to enter a unholy contract between themselves and Saudi Arabia in order to get Saudi Arabia to influence the OPEC nations to trade only in US dollars for oil. And this system's lasted for over 50 years. Now, all this time we've seen the financial system being driven by the US dollar, backed up by gold, backed up by petrol, oil, and gold kind of like was free to um, become a floating asset. What I mean by floating asset is that the value of gold in US dollar terms and other foreign currency terms would be able to vary much more than it used to under the gold standard. Now we've seen what happened with the price of gold. 35 US dollars an ounce in around the 1950s, 1960s.
It was held there though, wasn't it? It was
Correct.
held at 35. It wasn't the true value of it.
Yeah, that's right. It was held there because at least the currencies were pegged to the price
Yes.
of gold. But once they moved it, and we had the US dollar, the petrodollar as a reserve currency, you're valuing all the assets relative to the US dollar rather than gold.
Yeah.
So gold increased from $42 by about early 1970s to 850 in 1980, dropped back down to the $200 zone, $250 zone, stayed there for about 15, 20 years between $200 and $500. Then it hit $1,000 in 2007 for the first time. It hit 2,000 US dollars for the first time in 2020, and it smashed through $2,500, $2,700 this year alone. Um, the implications of this is massive because we've seen inflation, we've seen falling purchasing power, and this is also the reason why you had the populist movements happen around the world. And of course, the US in the United States, President Trump and the America First, Make America Great Again movement became the key movement highlighting the population's awakening to a system that is not for them, a system that is quietly impoverishing them, again, in the to the at the, through the benefit of those who know the system, those who run the system, and those who hope to keep this system as is in order to um, continue enriching themselves at the expense of the many.
You do so. I totally get what you're saying in terms of there's a choice, right, and there's a bureaucracy, and the Trump's utilizing that what would you say, feeling in populist feeling in people to smash the swamp, or however you want to phrase it. But also, Brian, what you also say is that despite who actually wins and despite the political uncertainty, you do emphasize that the US national debt, nothing's really going to happen or change there, right? Whoever gets in, if you look at their policies, national debt's going to continue rising most likely regardless. So my question is, what specific implications does this have for investors, particularly in the context of gold's recent performance, which you've obviously said is smashing all-time highs now? What does that mean? Well, what does the next 5 years look like?
Yeah. So I would say depending on who wins, because this I call this election a reality TV show. Um, Personally speaking, I don't believe that the number of votes counted truly reflects who actually the people who cast those votes. So I'm one of those election deniers out there, because I've seen the inconsistencies. And if for the readers, you should actually go and have a look at the sources that I've quoted, and uh, think for yourself. I don't believe the U.S. election is unique in itself. That there are potential inconsistencies and potential for results to not reflect the will of the people. I think this is actually a worldwide thing. Um, but it's just that it's a case of how plausible it is to the people in different countries, and to what extent people are able to go and find out whether they what types of shenanigans are being played. But going back to the implications of whoever gets into power, I reckon the next 2 years, Congress and whoever is the president will have a fight amongst themselves, simply because you still have a Congress that is heavily entrenched with the unelected bureaucrats. A lot of them have significant interests with them through donors' money, through business relationships, or through potential compromises. And I mentioned, of course, JE and P Diddy, simply because I don't want this channel to be to get a strike. But you guys should know what I mean. Um, and these people are going to protect themselves and protect their puppet masters. Now, with the national debt, it's clear that neither candidate plan or can implement a cost-cutting policy for quite some time, simply because there are lots of um, just a lot of mess inside the country. Either way, either they want to perpetuate the mess, or they want to try to clean it up, and that's going to cost the country a lot. Now, with the national debt rising and the interest rate falling across the world, with the central banks now all moving towards cutting rates, inflation will come back. And to fight inflation and the loss of purchasing power, and to keep the masses happy, government will have to implement certain measures to try to give the people a helping hand, or at least appear to. It's a lot more about optics than the practicality of it. So that's why I believe in the longer term, gold, silver, real assets are going to rise, because the supply of currencies are going to far exceed the amount of metals that are extracted from the ground or being sold back into the markets. Now, in the short term, especially in the coming month, as we see the unfolding of who could be leading, who's going to lag, who will eventually be confirmed the winner, and the many political games that will play out in Congress, especially in the case that President Trump wins. There, his opponents have clearly laid out all the strategies they're going to throw in Congress and outside of Congress to prevent him from taking office. All that is going to create market volatility. And I believe as much as gold has historically been a safe haven, it will not be safe from it will not be safe from the ups and downs that we're going to watch. Personally, I'm going to try to see through this drama and look at the medium and long term, because that's where I think the most successful investors build their wealth. It is through seeing past the noise in the short term, not bowing to one's emotions when the markets are gyrating. The money in the stock market is transferred from the under impatient to the patient, and there is no better time for this particular wisdom to apply. And that's why I would advocate people to be um, cautious, to watch the show, and don't let your head prevail over your heart. The stories are going to target your mind and shake you out of your wealth that you have worked so hard to build.
I have a final question, Brian. It's more bringing it back to Australia.
Yeah,
So you point out that gold has doubled. So it's gone up massively in
doubled in the
US
last
dollars,
five
but it's
years.
actually doubled since 2019 in Australian dollars. That's like significant.
Yes.
How do you see that particular trend developing? Should we just end on that question there
Yeah,
to wrap this one up?
that's a good question, because the Australian dollar, I can't remember whether we were discussing about this or it was somewhere else, but the trade between US and Australia still remains the strongest, even
Mm.
though China is increasingly becoming our major trading partner. Now, whoever is going to be president will affect that balance of trade to some extent. So the Australian dollar is going to move quite a bit, and the price of gold in Australian dollars is going to vary a lot. But if you look at between 2007 to 2019, when gold doubled from $1,000 to $2,000, a lot happened. Gold went up to as much as $1,880 an ounce in 2011, when the Australian dollar was stronger than the US dollar, and fell to as little as 1,200 Australian dollars in around 2013, within a space of a year and a half. But then gold went up from 1,400 Australian dollars an ounce in about 2015. Actually, no, 1,600 Australian dollars an ounce to over $2,000 an ounce in a space of a year in 2018 to 2009,
Hmm.
2019. So I would say the Australian dollar is going to likely weaken in the coming few years, and with gold being on the uptrend, with the central banks reducing interest rates in the next at least 2 years or so, that's going to have a very bullish implication on the Australian dollar price of gold going forward. Of course, with quite a bit of volatility in the
Hmm.
midst. So that's where I continue to store my personal wealth. When I take some profits in my stocks, some of that's going to just go to bullion, and I'm not going to let the daily movements worry me into buying or selling into the crowd. But that's
Good
personal
stuff.
advice, of course.
Yeah,
Everyone should focus on what their strengths are and invest accordingly.
it's not personal. Yeah, it's not personal, but yeah, totally get you, Brian. Well, thanks for that, Brian. It's fascinating stuff. If you'd like to read Brian's article today, please do. The link, the direct to the article is in the description below. It's 100% free. Do let us know what you think. And Brian, thank you so much for your time today, mate.
Thanks, Woody, and everyone. God bless and enjoy the show.